Would all who care to join me in the Pledge of Allegiance?
If I do it this time, I don't have to do it next time.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. And could we get a roll call, please?
Councilmember Castellano.
Here.
Councilmember Moulton.
Here.
Councilmember Fernandez.
Here.
Councilmember Bauer.
Here.
Councilmember Contreras de Loche.
Here.
Mayor Burgell.
Here. And with that, we'll open up this special meeting with Director of Development Services, Kenyon.
Thank you, Mayor. All right, sorry, just had a little bit of technical difficulties. This Gulch Greenway ordinance effort is have help from consultant Ben Noble, who's on Zoom. So I'm gonna we have a combined presentation that's very short, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and comments. So I'm gonna be starting the presentation, and then I'm gonna be passing it off to Ben. So to begin, what is a Gulch Greenway? It's a vegetated area around a valley or ravine that varies in size and topography. And these vegetated corridors contain wetlands and watercourses that eventually flow to Humboldt Bay. If you look at an aerial image of the city of Eureka, the Gulch Greenways are the green fingers that cut across and disrupt our urban street grid. They look really obvious on an aerial image, but they're actually kind of hard to map. This map shows the city boundary in a black dotted line and the coastal zone in light blue. This planning effort is focused on adopting Gulch Greenway regulations into our inland code, so outside of the coastal zone within the incorporated city of Eureka. So these regulations would affect Cooper Gulch and Second or McFarland at the northwestern edge of the city, which drain north to Eureka Slough, and the gulches of Martin Slough at the southern end of the city, which drain southwest to Elk River, eventually to Elk River in Humboldt Bay. So what is the goal of this planning effort? The impetus for it is that our general plan, which is the city's guiding planning document, calls for us to prepare and adopt Gulch Greenway preservation and management guidelines. And this is actually a goal that was in our previous general plan as well. And it's one of the things that our general plan environmental impact report relied upon in analyzing the environmental impacts of our future growth through 2040. The current inland zoning code has no regulations that afford special protections to wetland streams in riparian habitat, and no standards that specifically limit development on steep slopes. Here's a map showing the general gulch areas with private lands in blue and publicly owned parcels in green. Over 75% of the land in the gulches is privately owned. And then this map shows that the majority of the land is also zoned residential. And in residential districts currently in the inland area of the city, typically only building permits are required for residential structures and for grading. And that means that there's no discretionary review and therefore no CEQA environmental review. Without environmental standards in our code or discretionary review, the city has no regulatory tools to prevent further fragmentation and degradation from development. In 2022, the city began the process of preparing a Gulch Greenway ordinance, and the city conducted a virtual public workshop in March of 22 and completed a public survey in April. The city then published draft a draft ordinance and mapping methodology, which was reviewed by the Open Space Parks and Recreation Commission and the Planning Commission. City staff with planning consultant Ben Noble is now in the process of revising that 2022 draft ordinance with the goal of bringing a revised draft to council in early 2025. The purpose of tonight's meeting is to update council on the direction of those revisions. And one last thing that I wanted to say before I pass it off to consultant Noble is that a key tricky thing about the Gulch Greenway Ordinance is striking the right balance between our general plan goals that call for preserving and enhancing natural open space, and then our general plan goals that call for maximizing housing potential on the few remaining vacant and underutilized sites in the city. And this is actually a map of how when we adopt our housing element, we have to demonstrate what sites are available to meet our regional housing needs allocation, or RHNA. And many of the sites that we identified were on the Gulch Greenways, because that's really where a lot of our very few remaining vacant sites are located. So it's a tricky balance. And now I'm going to pass it off to Ben. Derek, can Ben unmute himself?
I can unmute myself. Let's see if I can start my video too. Let's see. Zoom is not allowing me to start. Oh, there it goes. All right. Thank you, Kristen. So again, my name is Ben Noble. I am the city's consultant assisting with the Gulch Greenway Ordinance, and I was also the consultant that was involved in the update of the zoning code that was approved in 2019. So I'm really happy to be working with the city again on this. So I'm going to take a few minutes to review some of the highlights of the approach. These are the same topics that are discussed in the staff report. Next slide, please. So the first topic has to do with the map of the Gulch Greenways. So as Kristen mentioned, accurately mapping the Gulch Greenways on a citywide scale is difficult, largely because site-specific streams and wetland investigation to define those boundaries is cost prohibitive and infeasible. Next slide, please. And so given that, and also given the importance of accurate Gulch Greenway boundaries, our approach moving forward is to establish a Gulch Greenway overlay zone. The city already has a number of overlay zones in the zoning code that apply to properties. And an overlay zone is simply identifies the geographic areas where unique permit requirements and standards apply. So what we're envisioning is that we would create a parcel-specific map of all of the parcels in Eureka that are within or 100 feet of steep slopes, riparian drip lines, floodplains, and known streams or wetlands. And the intent of this is to use this map as a screening tool to identify parcels on which development might create a concern for the protection of natural resources in and around the Gulch Greenways. Next slide, please. And so zooming in on an example of the 2022 Gulch Greenway mapping, you can see that there is an attempt to establish a precise boundary defined by vegetative cover and slope and proximity to known wetlands and streams that resulted in a map that looked like this. There are numerous instances where the boundary of the Gulch Greenway raises questions as it was mapped. And so to create a precise site-specific map of this nature would require considerable additional time and financial resources. Next slide, please. So the alternative, which we think is preferable, is to establish the Gulch Greenway Overlay Zone, which will follow parcel boundaries. And then so if there is a development project application with within any of these parcels, that's flagged for city staff and the applicant to know that additional permit requirements might apply and standards might apply depending on the nature of that development project. Next slide, please. And so following up on that, speak a little bit about permits required and, as an example, permits required for different types of vegetation removal. So the general concept is that the Gulch Greenway Ordinance will identify different types of permits for different types of development. And the type of permit that's required will depend largely on how impactful that development might be on natural resources. So for many of the development projects, no additional permit would be required because at the front end, those can be deemed as less impactful or not impactful at all, and therefore no additional permit would be required. As development becomes more impactful on natural resources, closer scrutiny would be required. So that may be a zoning clearance, which is essentially a staff level review of a project to verify that it conforms with all applicable standards. And then there's a minor use permit, which is discretionary action, but at the staff level. And then you have a conditional use permit, which requires a planning commission hearing and is a discretionary review. Both types of use permits also would trigger the requirement for environmental review under CEQA. Next slide, please. So to illustrate this approach, we're looking at vegetation removal, and the Gulch Greenway Ordinance would specify permit requirements for different types of vegetation removal for projects that are within the Gulch Greenway Overlay Zone. So for example, if there's invasive vegetation removal, this is something that the city wants to encourage, no additional permit would be required. However, if there was an application or a proposal to remove trees that are native to the region, this would require a discretionary permit, which would also trigger CEQA requirements. And then there's other types of less impactful vegetation removal, maybe limited to a smaller geographic area. That's something that could be addressed with a zoning clearance that would not trigger any kind of discretionary review, and simply the city staff can confirm that it complies with applicable standards. So all of this will require changes to the city's existing tree removal regulations. Next slide, please. So another topic that we've been thinking about with the Gulch Greenway Ordinance is how to handle proposed development within existing improved yard areas. So as shown on the screen, the green is the 2022 mapped Gulch Greenway management area boundary. And there are many parcels that contain a existing single-family home, improved lot area, as well as Gulch Greenway habitats such as riparian cover and steep slopes. Next slide, please. And so the question is, well, how to handle both permit requirements and standards for these types of property. On the screen right now is a more zoomed in image that shows a common arrangement of a single family home with an improved yard area on the front end of the parcel with riparian habitat on the lower part of the parcel. So our thinking on this is that outside of the steep slope riparian dripline area, that no additional permit would be required beyond what the city already requires, but we would refer permit applications to CDFW for their review. Within the steep slope riparian dripline, the green area shown on this image, higher scrutiny would be appropriate, where development, depending on the nature of that development, would require either a zoning clearance or use permit, again with CDFW referral, and for projects that require a use permit, that would trigger environmental review under CEQA. Next slide, please. So the last topic that Kristen alluded to in her introduction has to do with housing production. And in the last couple of years, I think as we all know, the state has enacted a number of new housing laws aimed at facilitating the production of housing in California, particularly more affordable housing. The Housing Crisis Act, which was adopted in 2019, has language that limits the ability for cities to adopt any new regulations that reduce the potential intensity of residential development on a lot. That's one example of state law. There are other state laws as well that's relevant to the city's consideration of any new regulations that apply within residentially zoned parcels in the Gulch Greenway area. And also, as Kristen mentioned, there's the housing element, which identifies sites that the city will use to accommodate residential development to meet the city's fair share housing need for the upcoming housing element planning period. Next slide, please. So given all of that, we think it's important to craft the Gulch Greenway ordinance in a way that appropriately balances the desire to protect natural resources with the city's obligation under state law to facilitate housing production. So the plan is on vacant residentially zoned parcels to craft the ordinance in a way that would allow housing at the intensities that are currently allowed, but to do it in a way that either entirely avoids or minimizes to the extent possible adverse impacts on natural resources. And fortunately, the city already has a tool within its zoning code that can be used to accomplish that, and that's the conservation subdivision. And the image on the screen is a graphic from the zoning code that illustrates the concept. And essentially what the conservation subdivision does is it allows the clustering of development with homes on smaller lots or even multifamily housing types if those units are located on the lot away from natural resources. So that's a way to both protect natural resources in the Gulch Greenways, as well as to allow for residential development as currently envisioned within the city's general plan, consistent with state law. So that's a big part of our approach to the further revisions of the Gulch Greenway ordinance that we wanted to share with you tonight at this meeting. Next slide, please. And I think with that, that concludes our presentation, and I'll hand it back to Kristen and the City Council.
Yep, handing it back to the mayor. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you. Do we have any questions? Councilmember Bauer?
Thank you, Director Kenyon and Mr. Noble, for that presentation. I had a question about the housing element. I think it says there's 48 parcels, right, that were identified. Maybe it's in the agenda summary, one of the documents. And I'm just curious that none of those parcels were identified in our current RENA, though, right? They're like potential housing, but they're not included in our existing.
They were adopted.
They were adopted
as sites that can accommodate our moderate and above moderate RENA. So, we have these 952 units at different income levels, and most of our low and all of our very low, we are showing that we can accommodate it on 14 city-owned sites, But for our moderate and above moderate, we identified privately owned, vacant and underutilized sites to accommodate that RENA.
Okay.
Doesn't mean it necessarily has to be built. We have to just demonstrate we can accommodate it, and we can't downzone those to natural resource zoning, and not be able to accommodate it. And it was just one residential unit per lot that we identified in our current housing element.
Okay. So like I was just thinking of parcels in the middle of a greenway, like there's no future subdivisions planned. Like
we
right in
did the ones that were identified in our housing element are on the edges of the Gulch Greenway with access to a road and a buildable envelope.
Okay. So just like existing lots that haven't really been developed.
Correct.
Yeah.
Ones that have maybe some upland and then they fall off into the gulch.
Okay. And I think it's on page 3. We and this is just for the public to understand that we say in 2021 we began the preparation of the ordinance, but I talked to former council member Linda Atkins the other day, and she was like, "We've been talking about this since 2002 or something." Just so people understand, this isn't coming out of left field. It's been a long time, but the actual ordinance is being developed just recently.
Correct. That's why I added a footnote to that page to acknowledge that that we've been trying to do this for a long time, and there was a really big effort. It looks like from the historic files, it was between 2002 or 3 and 2010, and there were like stakeholder outreach groups, and a lot of it came out of the OSPR, our Open Space Parks and Recreation Commission. They did a lot of work.
That's helpful. All right. I have a lot more questions, but I'll let someone else go if they want.
Councilmember Castellano?
Sure. I can also wait and hear more of Councilmember Bauer's questions too. Let's see. Just a follow-up question to the only one residence per, or the residential lots. ADUs would be allowed ministerially with current housing law, right? So like if one house could be built a certain, 2 or 4, I know there's new ADU law that's just got enacted.
I can answer that, and then maybe Ben, you want to follow up. Yes, for every existing or proposed single family home, state law says that one accessory dwelling unit is allowed, and for anything that's a duplex or larger, 2 detached ADUs are allowed, and they are supposed to be processed ministerially. Although in the coastal zone, they still require a coastal development permit without a public hearing.
Thank you.
Ben, is there anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would add that on a lot with a single family home, either existing or proposed, that you could have a one ADU, plus you can also have something that's called a junior ADU, which is a small ADU within existing floor area of the single family dwelling. So within the Gulch Greenway overlay zone, that those ADUs would be allowed for single family homes, and then additional ADUs also possible if there are multifamily dwellings existing or approved on the lot.
Thank you. And then I like the idea of conservation subdivisions, and especially in areas where they work and they help conserve resources and resource lands. And I'm just curious what might be the ways to promote or encourage those, in terms of like waiver of fees, or potential use of like housing trust fund, or requiring conservation subdivisions in specific areas.
I think if we do adopt a Gulch Greenway ordinance where we make where we're triggering, we have standards and we have more discretionary review, and we have a standard that, your subdivision minimizes impacts, then that will encourage conservation subdivisions, because that would be the way to minimize impacts. Ben, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I think that's all correct. I think on many of these parcels, the only way to achieve the higher number of units that are allowed under existing density would be with the conservation subdivision. So I think that then becomes a pretty powerful incentive for an applicant to use that tool.
That's true. If somebody has a parcel that has a little upland area and then steep slopes and wetlands, they're going to want to avoid those anyway because it's difficult to build in. And then a conservation subdivision would then allow them greater density on the upland area by keeping the rest of it as open space. But we have not gotten one yet, and we did adopt it into our code in 2019.
Exactly, and that's, I think, part of the question is, a lot of them might even involve like different people own the parcels, or things like that. And so I'm just curious, what are the ways that we can't make people play together, but that we might encourage that kind of good land use planning, in terms of actually it being enacted. Because, we can create all of the possibilities for things we want, but if they're not practical for people to actually build, then it still won't happen. Or maybe it'll happen, once every 50 years or something. So maybe that's a rhetorical question, but, just kind of thinking out loud here. Let's see. Are there, and I guess the one other question is just like, in terms of, right, I think one of the things we're wrestling with is just kind of the habitat and the kind of resource protection and environmental protections that are really valuable in the gulches and greenways, and especially as we're doing a lot of restoration around sloughs and things like that. Are there, and I think the question is just like, when we look at habitat, so we're looking at housing, we're looking at greens, and then we're looking at habitat. Are there kind of maps or an understanding of like what the best opportunities are for continuing to rehabilitate and restore habitat as part of this process?
Yeah, I don't know how to answer that. The purpose of the process is it's to create a process so that we're actually flagging development that occurs. Because right now people are building garages, putting generators in, and we're giving them building permits, and we're not even looking if there's habitat around. And then I also think, if they're doing something that could be impactful, triggering a discretionary review, triggering potentially mitigation, including potentially conservation easement on part of it. I think, our gulch greenways are our best opportunity for habitat protection and connectivity. And so, thinking through ways to encourage there to be less development potential in the stream areas and along the slopes of the gulches, which is the intent of this ordinance.
Thank you. Yeah, it makes me imagine, like, if there was a salmon looking at this plan, right? How would the salmon look at the plant? Like, what is the plan for the eyes of the salmon, I guess, I don't know. Maybe it doesn't exist yet, but that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, and CDFW will tell you that their staff is here and will probably comment that the trees on the slopes on the sides of the gulches are really critical to making the salmon happy. So we have to think past just the bank and the top of bank and think about the vegetation that's shading that watershed.
Thank you.
Councilmember Fernandez.
I'm hoping you can help me understand this a little better. The concept of the conservation subdivision, that's part of the overlay. Or am I misunderstanding something?
Ben, you want to field that?
Sure. So the conservation subdivision is something that's existing within the zoning code. And so the concept for the Gulch Greenway overlay zone is to explicitly make it clear that the conservation subdivisions are permitted or even sort of incentivized within the Gulch Greenway area. The prior draft from 2022, I think, took a more restrictive approach to subdivisions within mapped Gulch Greenway areas. And I think what we want to do is revisit that so that this existing tool, the conservation subdivision, will be available for a property owner within the Gulch Greenway area.
Okay, and when we're talking about property owners, then we're also talking about not just vacant parcels, but parcels that already have an existing structure, a residence, or that's the only thing I can think of that would exist. Hopefully.
Yeah. So if there is sort of subdivision potential on a property because of the lot size, then even if there was an existing home, conservation subdivision sort of, in concept would be something that would be available.
Okay. And then I know based on some of the earlier questions, ADUs would be subject to this ordinance. And so I'm curious, based on some of the recommendations from CDFW, and it seemed like where it was going, at least in conversation, is would it be permissible then to involve them in the ministerial review portion of that process or these processes?
Yes, I think so. Because they have a 1600 permit if you're impacting a stream. So I think that's something we try to do with our ministerial building permits, is to refer them to other agencies that might have permitting authority.
Okay. And, well, I mean, the reason I ask is I know that in their recommendations, that was one of the pieces that they asked for, was that they be included in the process. And so is that something that staff has considered since those recommendations have been made? Is that something we could add to this ordinance tonight? Because right now we're just discussing it and we're going to review it again, I assume.
Right.
Yeah.
All we have in your packet is the 2022 ordinance, and Ben Noble can back me up, but we definitely are going to put in something about CDFW referrals in the updated one. Correct,
Okay.
Ben?
Yeah, and I think that's a particularly important part of this. One of the fundamental objectives is to make sure that development that has the potential to impact natural resources in the Gulch Greenway areas, that CDFW has an opportunity to review and comment and confirm that that development is consistent with laws that they administer.
Right. And then was there any consideration to one of the recommendations being made where it asked specifically restrict work in the streams and wetlands between June and the end of October? Is there any reason that hadn't been added as part of this, or were there any concerns with that?
Yeah, that could be an objective standard that we add.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I would concur with that, and we will include standards that identify permitted timeframes for development in certain areas.
Right. Thank you.
Councilmember Bauer, just keeping in mind that it is 5:34 and we have our next meeting at 6 p.m.
All right, thank you. I need to do a caveat. I do work for a Department of Fish and Wildlife, but I work in the business of cannabis enforcement. I no business with what we're discussing today, so my comments are solely my own. I had a thought about people being concerned about their property loss of value or something to that effect. And, in the city of Arcata has invested a lot, mainly through, state funds, to purchase properties that are, all wetland or all stream or, something that really precludes them from development. Is there a way to incorporate as part of our objectives of this that, like Cooper Gulch, properties extending upstream that are within the greenways and within the greenway, or the gulch, I should say, we would potentially purchase and add on to a linear park or a linear, call it urban greenway or something, just to, trying to work with landowners and to the benefit of the city and the citizens, I think is something to consider in the future. Like, how do we deal with that?
I definitely agree that that'd be great if we could purchase more of the Gulch Greenway so that it's not in private development. I don't think that makes sense in the zoning code, because that's more of like a general plan policy and program, because this is more regulating projects that come in. But here, a mitigation for a private development project could be putting some sort of easement over something or deeding it to the city, which people actually probably wouldn't hate in certain circumstances, because they do have to pay property taxes on the portions of their lots that are undevelopable.
No, yeah. That's what I'm kind of referring to, something like an easement or something to that effect. That would be great. And then I had one more comment, sorry, on, where is it, page, oh geez, I lost it here. It's on the mapping, page 2 of the mapping methodology, and it's item D. It just says something to the effect that if the mapping doesn't meet the texture, does not
the textual definition.
Yeah, the textual definition, it may be removed as determined by the director. I think that would be great if it was someone like you, in the future, not the right director, but some other director could be making calls that I think require professional expertise, when it comes to what is this environment look like. So I'm just concerned about that a little bit, that it's.
Yeah, so this was our concept in 2022 for mapping methodology, but now we're thinking, instead of mapping precisely, we're just going to have a list of APNs essentially and screen that way.
Okay. But looking out for other opinions as to, like, what does this habitat qualify as?
Correct.
Right? Okay.
We do have 1 foot contour interval LiDAR, so we can identify steep slopes. And then we have really detailed 2023 aerial imagery from flyover we paid for. So I think that'll be our base image when we're determining, like, what's a developed yard versus what is undeveloped habitat.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you all. And with that, we will move on to public comment. Pursuant to the Brown Act, Section 54954.3a, the public shall be provided an opportunity to speak only on items that are listed on the special meeting agenda. Pursuant to City Council Resolution 2011-22, City Council policy is to limit each speaker to 3 minutes. Such time allotment or portion thereof shall not be transferred to other speakers. Do we have anyone from the public who'd like to comment on this item? Come on up. Welcome.
Hi, my name is Jim Clark. I've been lived in and around the city since 1980. I'm a Gulch fan, and I really like your approach. And Leslie, I think what you were getting at is providing some extra incentive, because a lot of the gulches that we have been impacted. They've been degraded in many ways. So what happens to a gulch and greenway happens above the drip line as well as within it. So I think a holistic approach is warranted to look at the whole development. Many of these lots are street at the top, gulch at the bottom, and the properties in between. So that everything affects that gulch that drains into it. And I really like the idea of having incentives and looking at the property owners as a partner in protecting the gulch, and say, oh, you want to build maybe a little beyond what is impermeable coverage? Maybe you can mitigate that by improving habitat or putting an easement over it to reduce the property taxes on places you can't develop. So thank you, and I'll be working with you, I hope.
Thank you, Jim. Welcome.
Hi, I'm Katie Rion. I'm with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. I authored the letter that's included with your package, and I wanted to express our support for the Gulch Greenways Ordinance and our willingness and happiness to work with the city moving forward. And I'm happy to answer any questions and enter into further discussion. So please feel free to contact me if anything comes up. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. Is there anyone else in the audience that would care to comment on this item? Seeing no one, is there anyone on Zoom, Shannon?
Craig Benson.
Hi, am I unmuted? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much, and hello, City Council. And I'm just so pleased, as someone who served on OSPR for 10 years and was part of the Greenways and Gulches Committee, I'm just so pleased to see the progress. So just fantastic work to Director Kenyon and to the consultant, Ben Noble. Things that I really like that I'm hearing. I really love the Gulch Greenway overlay zone. It's geomorphic in terms of steepness, and it's ecologic in terms of riparian drip lines, and it's hydraulic with known wetlands. So it really covers the bases. I think the map of the Greenways and Gulches, even at that general scale that you're showing it tonight, is helpful for the public just to sort of know if they're kind of in or near. And so, I mean, it's helpful at that level, not necessarily as the ultimate, defining a map. But that's a good one, and I like that the ordinance emphasizes what can be done and how, rather than what can't be done. And I think that's going to be much more acceptable to folks in Eureka than sort of all these restrictions and things that you can't do. I like the tenor of it. What I would recommend, and maybe I just missed it, that there be a clear grandfather clause for existing structures that are within that overlay zone. And I would also love to the City Council to consider really making a clear nexus with the Heritage Tree Ordinance and grading permits. There's already a nexus with CDFW 1600 permits and with CEQA, which you've already discussed tonight. And then also consider having a Greenway and Gulches guide. I've seen certain cities do that with their riparian and creek areas. RCA years ago created one, a stream guide that was called When You Live by a Stream, sort of the do's and don'ts, really simple pamphlet or small booklet, which could encourage that volunteer restoration that Leslie Castellano is asking for, but it also could have some language about landscaping in terms of native and ornamental plant recommendations and certain invasive plants to avoid. And that's what I have for you tonight. Thanks for your hard work on this. It's really great to see.
Thank you, Craig. And Jennifer?
Hi, everyone. Jennifer Call with Humboldt Waterkeeper. I, too, am really excited to see this moving forward. I actually have on my computer, I opened the 2008 comment letter from the Department of Fish and Game. It was so long ago, they changed their name. And this was on the 2007 draft Greenways and Gulches Ordinance. So this has indeed been a very long time coming. I think there's a lot of great ideas here. I'm going to, dig into the specifics more, but I just really, really want to strongly encourage the city to not delay this too much longer, because, right now the streams in these areas don't have any protections really other than the steep slope protections. And, really, I think a lot of people might regret building too close to a stream in such a damp cold climate anyway. You know, I've seen houses that are built right over wetlands, and it can't really be a great place to live in a lot of ways. So I think the conservation subdivisions seem like a good potential idea, and you know, just looking forward to having this finally done so that those streams can get protected, because as you know, they're, you know, some of them are coho bearing streams. They all drain into Humboldt Bay, and they're just very, very important for water quality, habitat, and as Kristen Kenyon said, connectivity. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jennifer. Do you see anybody else up there?
I see no one else on Zoom.
Seeing no one, we'll bring it back to council. It is 5:46, so please keep your comments brief. Councilmember Contreras-Deloche.
My brief comment. I didn't realize, you know, just that this had been in the works or been discussed for so long. I'm appreciative that, you know, that this is being pursued. I'm concerned, you know, going through and reading some of the public comments that were submitted to us, you know, through email and that kind of thing. It makes sense for us to try to come up with good ways to protect. We're doing all these different things like the restoration of these areas so that the salmonids have this, you know, passage, and it just makes sense that we need to come up with something additional so that we're not, you know, plugging one hole and then kicking a hole through the bottom of the boat. So I feel like, yeah, we need to come up with some way to kind of make sure that everything's kind of working in tandem. These are kind of critical, important environmental areas going all throughout our city, and we know every time we fiddle with something, it creates all these kinds of other effects downstream. So I think it's good that we're trying to come up with ways to mitigate that or minimize that. So that's my comment.
Comments? Councilmember Fernandez?
Yeah, I'm generally supportive of what we discussed here tonight, particularly with some of the recommendations that were made. And I really do like, I forget the commenter's name, but the one that referred to some sort of Greenway Gulch guide, because I think we offer something similar for ADUs, correct?
We don't have a pamphlet, but we do have information related to that. We have a similar one for street trees, so we can do something similar for this as well.
Yeah, I would be supportive of outreach in general if we were to approve this moving forward, especially for those parcels affected by this. So maybe we could mail something out.
I'm sure Ben is just licking his chops to help us put that together.
Okay. Thank you.
Councilmember Moulton?
I'll go ahead and thank you, of course, for doing this. I'll go ahead and sound my support of the idea of creating an easement for unbuildable sections of parcels, just as a consolation, so folks don't have to pay property tax on things they can't build on. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything, Councilmember Castellano?
Yeah, I appreciate the comment around, you know, landscaping recommendations, plans to avoid, and I do think that there may be opportunities to use some of our housing trust fund to help facilitate some of these conservation subdivisions or different kinds of planning, and so I do think it would be worthwhile to consider that. I like the overlay idea, and I think that, you know, it would be. And also I appreciate Councilmember Fernandez's recommendation or kind of implication of a recommendation of involving CDFW in terms of the ministerial permitting process. I do think it would be interesting to kind of create a map of how like salmonid habitat might expand, and I don't know, create some planning around how we might help facilitate that expansion as part of maybe a companion piece to this work. That's all for now. And thanks to everyone for their ongoing, long-standing effort on this.
Great. Did you want to say anything? Okay. Seeing no more comment, we want to thank everybody for coming. Thanks for the presentations, and we're adjourned until 6 o'clock. See you then.